Wunderbar, as the Germans say on this pod. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the NIL show. I'm Adam. There's Sean, joined by Tate Gillespie, Director of NIL Strategy here at Campus Inc., the one and only. This is episode lucky number 13, season 2. Man, and are we ever lucky? Because this last week has been absolutely insane in college sports, from transfer waiver, transfer portal, recruiting season open, bowl season, tip-off, not to mention there were a couple times, where we were watching the tweets, watching the announcements, and it was like, snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap, what you can do, what you can't do. So let's get into it, fellas. How are we feeling today? Are we anxious? Are we excited?
I feel like existing in college sports is just a constant state of anxiety, but it makes an excitement.
Tate, is it a little bit more comfortable being not when you're now that you're not at Kansas? You're a little bit more on the outside, and you don't have to have answers immediately for people that are asking for answers. Or how has that changed?
Yeah, I feel like you can kind of. I was just having this conversation with one of our partner NIL directors the other day about like how much different life is still in the industry, but not within the school and outside of a school, where I feel like I walk in every day knowing 99% this is what my day is going to look like for the most part. And I feel like I can stay pretty well on track on that, because, within a school, the interesting dynamic of it is all it takes is one athlete who, has a very particular question or something's gone wrong, and bam, there goes the week.
I think the only thing that has made me feel better about feeling like I can't keep up with everything that is happening in college athletics right now is that I see many of the top voices. My personal favorite is Amanda Kristovich from Front Office Sports. She's incredible. And I see her tweeting out like a cup of coffee, or I don't know, or maybe it was a wine glass at the end of the week. Like, we all need a drink because this week was a lot. Yeah. And she's covering that stuff full time. So that makes me feel much better about my thoughts on everything and how busy it's been. It's been crazy.
Yeah, that and one of my other favorites is Ross Dellinger's throwing the whiskey glass up there.
Yeah, that's right.
That kind of day. I get it.
It is insane. And we talk about this a lot, but I think it's important sometimes to step back and like just have a little bit of understanding of we are living through, I feel I'll put it out there. I'm a millennial, lived through countless unprecedented times. But chalk this up for another one of how it's just insane to watch this industry basically be a battlefield and blow up, one supposedly untouchable policy or tradition after another for the last 3 years running. And there's been a lot of leadership changes. We all know new president of the NCAA, head athletic directors switching around, presidents of universities switching around, head coaches switching around. But last week we were at Intercollegiate Athletics Forum, lots of sport leaders there. The other thing, Sean, that I'll say makes me feel a little bit better is they all kind of felt the same way. They're like, yeah, this is insane. We need some leadership. We need some guidance. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 3 years? But to Charlie Baker's credit, he did drop a proposal of saying, look, I've got an idea. I've got a plan. The merits of it are yet to be seen. But he is taking a very, progressive approach, active approach. He's not sitting back and waiting for the schools to tell him what the NCAA should do. He's listening, but also, putting out some active proposals. Let's dig into that a little bit of what his proposal actually entails. Tate, do you want to kind of give a little bit of a 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, we'll go like a 60,000 foot view.
Even better.
Stressing the key word is proposal. We'll see what gets read. People have already kind of started on the path of the red lines and finding the reason, that they think it won't work. I will say this before we get into it. I've probably been as critical of Charlie Baker as most people. I do want to give him credit for at least bringing something to the table, which is what people have been clamoring about from the NCAA for years and decades, is they've sat back and done nothing. For the first time, we've seen their leadership actually step up and say, hey, I have this idea, like you said, Adam, I'm proposing this. This is going to flip the system we know it on its head, but let's at least have a conversation about it. So I do want to give him fair due credit on that.
I like Tate.
Yeah, thank you. Congrats to myself.
Growth.
Essentially, so for those that don't know, essentially what Charlie Baker, NCAA president, proposed last week was a model and a system to allow schools to be more directly involved in compensating their athletes. How he wants to do this is through requiring, creating a new subdivision. We already see this a little bit in football where you have your FBS and your FCS. He's talking about creating a new subdivision within Division I, where this top subdivision, he didn't say it, but that number of schools is probably 60-ish to 70. Mm-hmm. You're kind of top 60, you're Power 4. Where if you want to play in this, level, you want to be a part of this, you have to invest at least $30,000 a year per student athlete into a trust fund. And that has to be for at least half of your student athletes. And I believe half of those student athletes have to be female to comply with Title IX. So that is the three, main caveats there of that. Obviously, the biggest criticism there comes on the line of, oh my God, the typical, my gosh, how are schools going to afford this? Yada, yada, yada. But that is a huge door to at least open of, hey, we want to allow schools to have a direct hand in compensating athletes. They're walking towards a revenue share model, right? Because that is sharing revenue with your athletes. We're walking there. He's not going to directly say ESPN or Fox is involved in that, but that's essentially what we're looking at there.
And I think there's a couple really interesting things for me when this came out. One, the timing of it right before the Intercollegiate Athletics Forum, right, where you've got all of Power 4 commissioners, a lot of the major sports leaders in the room, where he went up, got on a hot seat, and was able to kind of control and explain a little bit of why he wrote it that way. But there are a couple key takeaways for me from that proposal. The first is, what do we expect, right? This is the president of the NCAA. Do you really expect him to come out and say, oh yeah, we're going to, completely dismantle the NCAA as it exists, and we're going to, flip everything on its head? This is pretty much exactly what I would have expected from somebody in his position. And it's not all bad, because to your point, Tate, this is kind of the first official acknowledgement of, yes, we will 100% move in the direction of direct athlete compensation from the schools. Now, I get a little bit curious when words like trust fund are thrown around, because, what does that mean? What can you use it for when you have access to those funds? This is also not anything new from the Alston cases, or the Alston case rather, like that also created allowances for a trust fund. So there are a lot more questions, I think, that this proposal creates than answers. But if you can read between the lines a little bit, there's 100% acknowledgement of, we are moving the direction of rev sharing, and we are okay with it.
So yeah, I just want to make sure.
I also feel like, is this, my gut says, is this going to be the model that it is? No, it's going to get redlined. People are going to, throw back on it. Another interesting thing, though, I've seen from people a lot smarter than myself, a lot of the legal experts in the space have pointed out that, hey, when you start looking at, Adam, like you said, throwing words around like trust fund and do athletes not have access to that, that again falls into the category of good luck getting that by without collective bargaining. So I just want to point that out, that while we're moving in that direction, that's still going to be a hurdle that they're not going to clear by this measure.
Tate, I just want to make sure I understand the proposal logistically, how it works out. Say I'm Ohio State and I have 1,000 athletes. Then 500 of those athletes would have to be making at least $30,000, and then 250 of those 500 would be male athletes making that 30K, and 250 would be female athletes making 30K. And then they can pay athletes more, any of those 500 more than 30K if they want to as well. Is that am I understanding that right?
That 30,000 per year is a minimum investment that must be made per year that athlete's enrolled at that school. There's no cap on it from what I've read, that it can, sway and vary based on the athlete. But yeah, that's a look at half of your student athletes have to be invested $30,000 a year minimum in this trust fund.
And not to get too much in the nuances of Title IX legislation and stuff like that, but Title IX is a landmark legislation that's really important at protecting resources and rights for female athletes, and and sometimes gets thrown around and gets a bad rap because, of course, with any legislation, people can abuse it, but it actually matches to the percentage of your student athletes. So if 30% of your student athletes are female, then 30%, like that funding has to match the percentage of student athletes. If 30% of your student athletes are male, then that would be the same percentage of mapping there. So what does this mean for collectives? Because we've kind of created this environment where, hey man, collectives are the de facto marketing agency, the de facto vehicle of payment. They are the mechanism for compensation in this current model. Spun up really quickly with essentially no guardrails. We've seen wonderful things happen from that. We've seen terrible things happen from that. So, I mean, with revenue sharing, compensation being able to funnel through the schools directly, what do you think happens to collectives, Tate? Because there's a lot of people out here who have probably invested a lot of time, resources, energy, and professional capital in creating a collective to basically do this for the school.
Yeah, I think the best collectives, the ones that are run professionally, that are doing things the right way, that have the right people running them, they're going to continue to operate and have a place in the ecosystem. Because they do, like those top collectives that, we call, the good collectives, they do serve an invaluable purpose in that NIL ecosystem. For when you look at how big a percentage of total NIL compensation comes from them, they're ultimately, by and large, a good thing for college athletes because of how much compensation is coming from them. Mm-hmm. I think until it gets crystal clear that schools can directly pay athletes, even not through a trust fund, right? If there can be how a collective contract is structured right now on a 6-month basis, a 12-month basis, getting paid today, cash in your bank account, until that, mechanism is allowed by the school and becomes crystal clear, collectives will still continue to exist, because that's going to be a need that schools need to meet with recruits, with prospects that are coming in, with roster retention. The trust fund aspect is awesome. You can't recruit on a trust fund. Mm-hmm. In just today's climate, you need to compete with cash in hand and in expectation of roster retention. This is what's going to happen. So like we look at the Texas A&M model of where they tried to fold that in under their foundation. I personally love that. That's going to be the next logical step, I believe, for collectives, is coming in-house, folding in. And then what we'll see from that point on is the best collectives then turn to operate solely from a marketing arm for local businesses, activating with MMO partners, et cetera.
So, I mean, I agree 100%. Like when you look at a lot of the leaders of collectives, right? And shocker, I agree with you, Tate. We agree on a lot around here. When you look at the leadership in collectives, a lot of them actually have come from the institution or athletics department, right? And so you still have to operate within the bounds of the ecosystem. And I don't mean like legal bounds or policy bounds, but I mean in like the you have to be able to speak the language, right? And you have to be able to understand the challenges and the rhythms of recruiting cycles and what's important to programs, not important to programs. So, when people expect there to be this 100% firewall between, retention, recruiting, payment, marketing activations, and what the coaching staff and the athletics department and the teams need themselves. That's just unrealistic, because you're saying, hey, what's our current recruiting class look like coming in? What gaps do we need to fill? Like, there has to be an understanding of needs there. But it will be interesting to see that $30,000, whatever it ends up being, fund is going to be the new floor, right? That's going to be the new norm. And those top tier athletes, those top tier programs are going to demand or command something above and beyond that. And you see, University of Utah did this awesome thing. I think it's awesome for I think it was men's basketball and women's gymnastics, where they got a car for every participant on those teams. That stuff's not necessarily going to go away, nor do I think it should really. But that 30,000 foot, or that $30,000 is going to be the floor, and then you're going to still have to have somebody or someone working on behalf of that marketing arm to activate opportunities above and beyond what that new floor is. So I don't think what we see as athletes getting these really cool activations or signing these larger deals, that's not going away. All we're doing is creating a system that says, look, you don't have to 100% rely on all of these outside deals for any form of compensation or monetization that you can get as an athlete. And for some people, maybe for those who aren't super marketable, maybe for those who aren't really interested in becoming a brand and doing all of this thing above and beyond, that's a great thing, because you can say, look, I know I can at least get $120K if I maintain, 4 years of eligibility and good standing as an athlete. And that's going to set me up, in a good position upon graduation, without having to take on another full-time job of being, a brand and an influencer.
Yeah, 100%. And last thing I would say on that too is, like, to your point, when you look at how many athletes at a school the size of, they would have a total of 800 to 1,000 athletes or so, and let's say half of those athletes are receiving that's way more money than they would receive now in the current system of having to go out and do it themselves or rely on a third party collective to do it. So ultimately, yeah, it's a great thing. And then and you guys all know this, when coaches get in the room, nobody's ever going to be happy with, like, oh great, we got $30,000 is the floor that I can go sell. It's going to be school X, I'm hearing, is at 70K. Mm-hmm. We need to do that. And then, school Y said that they would give him 100K a year, but then they're also going to, pay him cash up front too. So that, and the trust fund. So we're still going to have, coaches that get in the room and bargain, compete against themselves to drive some prices up. So
speaking of, like, competing and trying to get after, certain athletes, let's talk waiver. Waivers are interesting. They're a very, in the coaching world, I wouldn't say controversial. Most people are kind of against the waivers until you need one. And then when you need one, it's the best thing ever. But Tate, walk us through all this waiver drama, or go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say, coaches have been waiver free this entire time. Now the players are just getting their chance.
That's a good point, actually. And we'll talk about this with the NLRB hearing as well. But coaches have never had to sit out for a year if they if they dip. So let's talk about waivers, Tate.
Yeah, I grew up the son of a basketball coach, and that resulted in me living in 6 different states before high school. So there was no waiver in place for that one. But this all goes back to a larger conversation we've been having the last 10 years in college sports of, like, athlete rights, that NIL is kind of also tied in now with the transfer, waivers and athletes' rights to transfer. It all goes into the same argument of, if there's an art student who's allowed to, make a painting and then go sell that painting, an athlete should have the right to monetize their talents as well. Goes back into the same thing. If there's an art student who wants to transfer to school, they don't have to sit out of next school's art program for a year or get approved to do it, right? Like it all goes back to athlete student rights.
So this last week, the NCAA came out and said basically, hey, we're not going to enforce our multi-time transfer policy, which says, hey, you cannot transfer multiple times and just play. You have to sit out. They said, you know what? We're not going to enforce this. There's a temporary restraining order on transfer restrictions. And they essentially said, if you have transferred, you are immediately eligible to play for the next 14 days, which was insane. What were you hearing from like people within your little circle of trust NIL directors? Was people's hair on fire? Like what was happening when all of a sudden the NCAA says, next 2 weeks, do whatever you guys want?
Well, it was a little scary is probably the best word I could put at it, because at that first time there was no clear indicator. They said, no, you could still lose a year of eligibility if you play within those 2 weeks. We could still nail you after this temporary restraining order is over. So there was a lot of risk, and there's a lot of people that were scared to do it. I did see a couple of schools that kind of said, you know what, no, hell, that we're doing it anyways. We're playing our guys, we're playing our girls that, they've earned this right. They've sat out. We're already into the season. We're going to go put them out there. But that was the biggest, feeling that I kept hearing out there was, okay, yeah, the next 2 weeks are open, but you're also telling me that while in these 2 weeks we don't have rules, you could retroactively go back and, take a year away from them. So that was the biggest feeling that I kept getting was like, hey, it was great, but like, man, we're doing this in the middle of the season and you're not giving us any further guidance on it.
How can the NCAA basically say, look, we're not going to enforce our policy for 14 days, but just so you know, after those 14 days, we will retroactively, like, isn't that entrapment? As a governing body, how can you maintain any sort of trust from your member institutions by baiting them into violating policies in a window where there's a restraining order? You can't do anything about it, but then warning them, oh, we're going to get you later though. Like, as an athletic director, as a student athlete, as anybody who's in the system, I'm like, how can I trust you with anything moving forward? How does the NCAA see a way out of just absolutely cutting the knees out from under that much trust with their member institutions?
I feel like that trust has been gone for quite a while.
Yeah, well, and on the NCAA side, don't they see, like, they don't agree with the hearing with the ruling here, and so they're still holding on to these hearings, thinking that perhaps their way will still happen, and so maybe that's why they're still threatening that. I don't know.
They're holding out hope that eventually they'll find a needle in the haystack of a judge or a legal expert that actually agrees with them and says what you're doing is okay, and that's a pipe dream. There's yet to be one that's taken a hard look at it and said, hey, that's okay. That's legally allowed. No, then that's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of precedent that's starting to get stacked up here. That's going to be, every day that goes by, it becomes increasingly difficult to go against that precedent for some of the things that the NCAA has put into practices.
I will say before we transition onto the next topic that it was pretty cool, some of the stories that came out from the players who were sitting, who thought they had to sit out, who got to play over the last 2 weeks. We saw our guy, Andre Curbelo, Illinois guy, who was one of the first ever Illinois NIL store athletes who transferred to St. John's. Now he's at Southern Miss, so it was cool to see him. And I have some other friends around the country who work for teams, and they had some players who thought they weren't playing this year. They had transferred for mental health reasons or whatever it was, and now they have their opportunity. So pretty cool. I've always thought if a coach can freely go wherever they want, probably should let the players do that, or else maybe they are employees, which leads maybe as a nice transition to the NLRB hearings, which you can touch on, Adam.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And in a lot of the crux of what this conversation is, there's a hearing right now at the National Labor Relations Board where this is essentially the hinge point of whether or not athletes should be or will be deemed as employees. And there's a little bit of context here. So the thing that's important to remember about all of these NIL conversations is we're approaching actually a decade of legislation and policy change and adjustment on NIL. This isn't new. The newest part is basically 2021, where the NCAA permitted athletes to actually exercise rights, and this is important, that they already had. So the crux of this conversation was the NCAA had policies restricting athletes from exercising rights to monetize their name, image, and likeness, which is illegal. That is the antitrust thing. You cannot restrict somebody from exercising rights that they are granted federally. So as the last couple of years have progressed, we are increasingly moving towards, okay, how much are you restricting us, number one, but number two, how much are you not providing for us that you should, if this relationship between student athletes and institutions is deemed more as an employee and employer relationship versus, an institution and a member of that institution relationship as a student. So there's a number of things, and there's a test that the NLRB runs through. Mitt talked about it a couple weeks ago, but a couple of those criteria are like how much is required, how much control does the overarching institution have over the schedule, travel expectations, time spent of a perceived employee, how much is required of them in terms of participation versus not participation. And a lot of this hearing kind of revolved around, it was funny kind of watching some of the lawyers make the arguments that college sports are much more like an extracurricular activity than they are a requirement. And my question to the panel with us today, since we've all been intimately tied to college athletics, Tate, when you were playing baseball and you had a film session, or you were a pitcher, so you had a bullpen day, that was pretty optional, right? You could be like, you know what? Yeah. This is an extracurricular. I'm a little busy today. I got to run to the mall, run some errands, drop some stuff off at the post office. It was like an optional activity for you, right?
Yeah, typically I'd be like, hey, I'm really tired today. I'm kind of sore, or like, man, I really need to study for this, this test, or I need to go home and, see family. Yeah, it was totally understandable. No, anybody that says college sports is, and I don't care if you're Division I, Division II, III, NAI, junior college does not matter. It's all the same. Anybody who calls that an extracurricular activity, either you didn't play, or I don't know, what your experience was like, because that was not mine as a player, and that's not what I saw our athletes go through.
So next, I don't know any athlete that feels like, oh yeah, I didn't feel any pressure to participate at all. The next question to me then is, because this was another piece that was brought up, was like, well, participation, you don't have to do that. Like, you can choose to not play your sport, which, again, valid. You can also not choose to work any job, but there are things like bills. There are things like rent and the consequential factor of food, that you have to pay for. A lot of athletes are on scholarship and wouldn't otherwise be able to afford attending an institution of higher education without this sports scholarship. So did you feel, sorry to put you on the spot here, Tate, at all, but did you feel any pressure to maintain your scholarship and perform at a high level so that you could actually stay in school and get your degree at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I knew that, I probably wouldn't go to school or graduate without being an athlete. So I knew I had to maintain that level of performance. And I actually, at my first school I went to, I lost my scholarship because I got injured. And so I lost my scholarship, which forced me to have to transfer to another school because I got injured. I didn't get injured skateboarding, around the parking lot. I got injured playing for my school, for my team. And because of that, injury, I lost my scholarship at that school. And so I was like, okay, I have to go, continue playing because I need to graduate, right? And you can't, I always say this, you can't have it both ways, in the sense of, for decades, their argument against, cash compensation to athletes was, well, the scholarship is, super valuable, but, that's, of so much value. It's a great value is how much we're giving you in a scholarship and room and board and a free education, right? That was the main argument against it. But then you can't turn around and say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. You didn't need it. You didn't have to play.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways on that front.
Yeah. And I think this is, I'm not fully convinced, to be fair. I'm not fully convinced that employee status is the best route. Just putting it out there. Not fully convinced yet. But I understand why the conversation is being had. And, for the layman who's out there and maybe hasn't dug into this a ton, this path is very complicated because, again, you're dealing with interstate competition. We've already talked about transfers, which, based on our government system, each state has different employability laws and different laws that govern the employee-employer relationship. And so this isn't just a blanket thing that you can say, call them employees and it's the end of the day. But it is an interesting kind of conversation around all of the things that come with being classified as an employee, meaning, the ability to collectively bargain, the ability to form unions, the ability to, have guaranteed payment and things like this. But another large conversation around the employment status is saying, okay, so how do other sports fit into this, or how does this impact the broader varsity sport ecosystem if we do go down the path of employability and you're having to meet the expectations of an employee-employer relationship for sports like football, and also meet the employee-employer relationship for sports like men's volleyball. We know women's volleyball is great and growing, but men's volleyball or track and field. Do you see colleges getting kind of backed into a corner of cutting sports if we go down this path?
Certainly my greatest fear when I look at it. I think that when we were talking about Charlie Baker's proposal, and I was kind of laying out the amount of athletes that are at schools. When you look at a school like Ohio State that has 1,000 athletes, it's a lot of athletes that you're going to end up having to pay. So cutting sports to me sounds like a very real thing that people would have to acknowledge, which is not what you want. That's terrible.
Yeah, that's certainly the last thing you would want to have happen. I mean, like, I was a baseball player. There's a lot of schools that would, they would love to cut baseball, right? Because it's an expensive sport. My wife was a soccer player. So coming from the vantage point of two of those sports that would be, potentially at risk, right, in this new model. So, it's definitely a soft spot for me, and one that I feel very strongly about. I also think, though, it's just a matter of having to take a look at where resources are going, where spending is going for some of these schools, because we've seen for years the facility spending get just out of control, inflated, ballooned, because frankly, and same with coaches' salaries, because they had nothing else to spend it on. So they're like, who needs a new lounge, a new locker room with a pull-out mattress in the locker?
Barbershop.
Right, like let's put everything in there and let's blow coaches' salaries up to be the highest paid employees in the state. And frankly, it just went unchecked for so long that now when you're talking NIL diverting resources away, if it is employee status and having school to athlete direct compensation, maybe, this is probably wishful thinking on my part. Maybe that's a natural market correction that needs to happen, and it's a more diversification of resources that these schools are going to have to do.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a number of years ago, and they've Alabama's athletic director made it very clear that they have since removed it. But a number of years ago, they put a water feature in the locker room, football locker room at Alabama, and like a lot of this employee conversation, and a lot of Charlie Baker's proposal, and what lobbyists are doing on Capitol Hill is saying, look, this is all well and good. Sure, let's make sure we compensate athletes, but man, we need to put a cap on this, right? We need to actually put some things in place that can stop the bleeding financially for us, because this can get out of hand really quickly. And I would say that's another example where you got to look at that and say, you're talking about both sides of your mouth, or out of both sides of your mouth. Where's the cap on coaches spending? Where's the cap on facility spending? Where's the cap on all of these other upgrades and things you're doing across campus? And there's a great article on Sportico. If you haven't read it, I would recommend reading it, by Michael McCann, who says, when you really start to look at some of this stuff, schools are getting dangerously close to tax fraud and claiming, nonprofit exemption from a lot of these things, while also paying an absolutely insane amount of money for stuff that no nonprofit in good faith would do. And we'll close with this, but his warning is, when you start to open up Pandora's box a little bit, and you start to go to Capitol Hill and start lobbying all this stuff and making claims about what you should be able to do and what you shouldn't be able to do, and protections you should have based on a current ecosystem, you got to be careful, because you never know who you're going to encourage to start poking and prodding under the hood more than maybe you would like them to. So it's going to be a really interesting, I don't know. How many years do you think this is going to go on? When do we start to see some resolution from this?
Well, it's going to be appeal after appeal after appeal, and lawyers get paid hourly, so they'll drag this out as long as we possibly.
What's the name of the UCLA quarterback? Chase
Griffin.
Chase Griffin. He's going to be president of the United States by the time all this finally goes through.
I hope he's president of the NCAA too while he's at it.
I love it. Well, I don't know how much we solved. We definitely didn't solve any of the world's problems. Probably didn't solve any of the NCAA's problems, but man, did we have fun doing it. I hope you all did as well, listening here. I'm Adam. There's Sean. That's Tate Gillespie. This is another episode of the NIL Show. We will catch you guys next week.